Hey, good morning, students. This is Dr. Larson giving you a lecture on global health financing. My apologies, I can't be there. I'm currently in Oregon, um, attending my grandfather's funeral today. So, today we're going to talk about the history of nations, a little bit of history of global health, and then global health financing and what it is today and over the last 100 years or so. A nation is a large group or collective of people with common characteristics attributed to them, including language, traditions, customs, habits, and ethnicity. Uh, we're going to talk a little bit about the last 100 years, the nations, and the changing map, and the implications that has had on global health in general. So before World War One, we had huge amounts of colonization. The late 1800s were characterized as the scramble for Africa. And I'm sorry if I sniffle or something, I'm a bit under the weather. But this scramble for Africa led to the colonization of much of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and the colonization in the American continents by European powers. And so this map on the left shows the ownership or the controlling country for much of the continent. You can see the dominant powers being England and France, and then German strongholds in Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, the Belgian Congo, which is one of the most atrocious regimes in the history of the world. If you have a chance to read the book King Leopold's Ghost, talks about how the Belgian king uh, conned the world into creating this protectorate state in the Congo and then exploited its resources and committed mass genocides. Um, then you have countries like Ethiopia, never been colonized. It's a very difficult terrain and hard to invade. The Ethiopians were able to repel any attackers. You had Liberia, that was created following the U.S. Civil War as a place for freed slaves to go if they would like, and that's the before World War One. Now, this map on the right was fascinating to me. That shows the German claims to the continent, and you notice that much of Central Africa is the Germans claim that as theirs, and they disregard much of the English claims, and then the Turkish are claiming much of, I guess, Asia Minor, Arabian Egypt in this map, and so there's competing areas, competing world powers for these colonies. In Asia, it was much the same, where you had significant colonies in the Indian subcontinent. It was controlled by the British, the Dutch in the East Indies, and even Korea was controlled by Japan. And China had these different enclaves, such as Hong Kong being British and others, and Macau being Portuguese. Even the U.S. got in on the action, and the Philippines. So it was this age of empires and this age of expansion from these European powers. World War One happened, the war to end all wars, and the way that World War One happened is pretty tragic. These cartoons portray what's happening. The end of World War One is the British and the French are carving up the globe. They're taking all of the claims from Germany, from the Ottoman Empire, and they're saying they now belong to us. And so they allocated, like Tanzania went over to England, the Middle East, Syria was given to France, and the rest was given to British as British colonies, and it's just awful. This cartoon on the right shows the carving up of China, much to the protest of the Chinese, represented by the man with his hands in the air, where Japan and Britain and France, and I don't know who that mustached man is, or the one of them, maybe Germany, they carve up China, and the U.S. looks on, Lady Liberty. Um, at the end of World War One, President Truman of the U.S. tried to establish the League of Nations. It was a war to end all wars, and Truman felt that it just needed to be amicably resolved. But British and France demanded reparations from the Germans, and set into motion, with the way World War I ended, it set into motion the rise of World War II. World War II became inevitable because of the way that World War I was, the treaty for World War I ending was negotiated. And so another good book that you should read is called Lawrence in Arabia. It's fantastic. It talks about the Arabian Peninsula of war between the Ottomans and the British and what happened following that war. Excuse me a moment. Sorry. All right. 1941, you had, the Germans had already invaded much of Europe, and you had the Allied powers, and they came together and created this Atlantic Charter. So you hear this picture of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, two statesmen that were visionaries. And the Atlantic Charter is awesome. All right, 1941, they say that we commit to no territorial gains. We commit that people should self-determine their territory. They have a right to self-determine their government. And then they have these other issues like global trade barriers should be lowered. The countries should cooperate together to improve well-being for all humans. They wanted a world free of terror, free of fear, free of want, and then freedom of the seas and the disarmament of nations. 1941 is beautiful. This is like you trying to say we want a utopian society. Now, pay attention to this right to self-determination and the people's self-determined territory. British was one of the original signatories to this, and look at what they gave up. The British Empire that spanned the globe. And then you have the French who also signed on to this, and the blue is the most recent French Empire that spanned much of the globe. And they were basically giving up this idea that they controlled these colonies, and they would allow the people to self-determine their government. In 1945, following the defeat of Germany and Japan in the World War II, you see the establishment of the United Nations. And the United Nations has 5 offices that were established at the time or later: the WorldBank, the World Health Organization, World Food Program, UNESCO, and UNICEF. And these institutions help to promote the Atlantic Charter ideals, and the United Nations is based on this Atlantic Charter. This map shows in light blue the countries that were original signatories to the United Nations. You'll notice in gray that there's a number of countries not signatories, like Germany, Japan. They just lost the war and were in post-war reconstruction, basically. In dark blue are the protectorates of the United Nations. And so they took all of the colonies and they took them under, and they provided more protection for them. You notice like Mozambique and Angola are not in dark blue. It's these 2 countries in southern Africa. It's because Portugal is also not one of the signatories. And so following the United Nations in the 60s and 70s, you had mass decolonization and the birth of many nations. And so you have in 1950s through 1974, much of sub-Saharan Africa became independent. Previous to 2000, you had many countries become independent, the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, and then much of the Soviet bloc countries became independent. Some of the last holds of the British Empire, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, became independent nations. And that has implications for the next event in 1978. Well, I guess we'll talk about that in a bit. But global health then is so that's the history of nations. And previous to all the independent nations, even continuing today, there's a definite colonialism in global health where England is more prone to help former British colonies. France is more prone to help former French colonies. And this can be evidenced with the Ebola crisis in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So Guinea used to be a French colony, Sierra Leone was a British colony, and Liberia was established by the U.S. And the response to the global to the Ebola epidemic saw France take care of Guinea, Britain took care of Sierra Leone, and the U.S. took care of Liberia. And it's much the same in today's world. So now we're going to transition into a bit of history of global health. Not much, but Thursday last week we talked about how global health is the practice of applying the principles of public health into the context of economic development and globalization. I like that definition for global health. Others have different definitions, as you know. So 1978, following the independence of the decolonization of much of the world, we had a huge conference in Kazakhstan called the Alma Ata, in Alma Ata, Kazakhstan. And there's Alma Ata Declaration. And this is where the country signed on to declare that health is a socioeconomic issue and a human right. They underlined the importance of primary health, and if primary health is the first interaction you have with a doctor or clinic, if you're sick, secondary and tertiary health would be going up the specialist to get maybe to the hospital or maybe a trauma center. And they wanted to ensure primary health care access or health for all by the year 2000. Very bold goals, but extremely important decisions to define health as a human right and a socioeconomic issue. Now, one of the big criticisms of Alma Ata is that health for all by 2000 is not a SMART goal. It's not this SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time sensitive. So they felt like it was not SMART. So the Millennium Development Goals were the next iteration, and then the Sustainable Development Goals after that. And we'll talk more about those on Thursday. So that's kind of the national development of global health. At the same time, you have this private level development of global health, or what's happening with the people. And I want to relate it back to efficacy. And so efficacy is the perception that a person's actions contribute to some effect. And so I have very high efficacy that if I eat food, then I will not be hungry. All right, you take a bite of food, and your hunger pains decrease. Now, with the rise of globalization, with a decrease in space and time in terms of communication and trade, the efficacy for people to help others increased. It's one of the big principles for improving this efficacy. And this can be witnessed with the Civil War. So in the U.S. in the 1860s, we had a really bloody Civil War, and it saw the rise or the establishment of the Red Cross, an organization that's still around today. And the Civil War was a narrated war where the casualties and the battles and the carnage was distributed in the press very quickly through the newspapers, and people followed along with the war for the first time in history. And that meant people far away could feel what was happening, and they could decide that they wanted to help. Previously, only people at the local scale could help or not. And so the decrease in space and time of communication meant that more people understood what was going on. They knew, they were aware. And with more timely awareness comes the ability to help more. In addition, you have the development, another important trend in this increase in efficacy for global health, or the ability to influence others' lives for good, is the development of specific exportable interventions. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about PEPFAR and PMI and a few of these other things today. All right, so financing then. So financing is the act of providing funds for, and I crossed out business and I put public health activities, making purchases or investing, and I added in health infrastructure, health professionals, or research. So it's just money. It's making sure you have the money to do what you want to do. If you want to make sure that people are going to survive, and you got to give them vitamins and immunizations, you have the money to buy the immunizations and get the immunizations to the people. So different levels of financing. The state level first is when one country gives money, or a government gives money to something else. So in state level financing, there's bilateral aid, which is direct from one country to another. And there's multilateral aid, where a country gives money to an organization and pools that money with others. And typically these organizations are the UN systems like WorldBank or World Health Organization, and then that money is then distributed by those organizations. The state level aid started in the United States around 1924, and then really became huge with the Marshall Plan following the World War II, where the United States spent millions of dollars rebuilding Europe, and then USAID was established in its current form in 1961. Now, state level aid always comes with an agenda. Governments do not give money to other governments without wanting something in return. The Marshall Plan. The United States wanted to decrease the chance of another world war. They wanted to increase their capacity to trade with Europe, and so they gave the money. And they wanted to help people as well, but those were kind of the state motive. Two other motivations include safety for the American people by decreased chance of world war, and prosperity for the American people by having a stronger trade partner to buy American goods. Now, USAID money today is often tied to principles of American democracy, freedom of the press, freedom to vote. And so it's used as a carrot and sometimes a stick to encourage other governments to adopt American ideals. And all countries have these agendas. China's agenda is to extract resources, and they're competing agendas one with the other. So the U.S. will label China as rogue aid, and China will label the U.S. as dead aid. So one example is Sudan and the Darfur conflict, South Sudan conflict. The U.S. would not give USAID money to Sudan because of their human rights record. China would, and they asked for oil rights or other rights, mining rights, and it's just a difference in priorities. But all state level financing for global health has an agenda behind it. The way that USAID money works, when a USAID pledges $100 million to some country, say they give it to Zambia, they will then take that and solicit proposals from organizations, for profit, not for profit, whatever, to go do the work that they have outlined. And so we'll talk about that with the NGOs or the INGOs. INGO stands for International Non-Governmental Organization, also called NGOs. And you need to know this term NGO. It's an extraneous para-government organization. They circumvent the system and provide health to the people. And they are financed through like USAID contracts or through private organizations and private donations, public donations. So, for donations from the public. And so one example of an NGO that gets public donations is WaterAid. They'll run their advertisements and show that they'll show that basically this is what you could buy with this donation. Water is important for health. This many people don't have water. Give us money, and we'll go improve access to clean water. Now, that's one way they get donations to the NGOs. Another way that NGOs get money or contracts is through contracts. Gets money is through contracts with aid organizations like USAID or DFID, which is the UK equivalent of USAID, and there's a balance there. Sorry, trying to think here. And this is my first time recording a lecture. I'm pretty new to it, and I don't know how to pause it, so I can't pause and think. So, all right, let's move on. All right, then there's the Global Fund. So the Global Fund, established in 2001, public-private partnership. It is the largest financier of global health today. Focuses on HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, and it gets donations from nations, and it's part of that multilateral aid. A lot of that goes to the Global Fund, and also foundations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, the Global Fund gives its money directly to states, directly to governments. Countries will apply for Global Fund dollars. They'll send in a proposal, which includes strict financial controls and corruption accountability. And Global Fund is very strict on this corruption stuff. They will pull funds and put people in jail. And and it's directly to the government. That is in contrast to NGOs that work outside of the government system and in cooperation with the government in some instances, other instances no. But there's pluses and minuses to that. If you go outside the government system, there's an argument that you're weakening the government institutions. If you go through the government systems, then there's an argument that you are feeding a bureaucracy and this uncontrollable spending. Then there's foundations. So I highlighted 3 foundations here. On the left, you have Bill Gates and Melinda Gates. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, established around year 2000. Bill Gates made billions in Microsoft and personal computing. And then he and Melinda Gates established this foundation. And their foundation focuses on research and development for novel solutions for old problems. And they do a lot of drug discovery. They do a lot of intervention development, a lot of science. They're less involved with the operations, though they do fund an NGO called PATH quite heavily, and that's out of Seattle, where the Gates Foundation is located, and that's a program for appropriate technology in health. And they do some. So an example of the way the Gates Foundation works is I work with the Gates Foundation in Zambia, and they have a huge budget, $30 million to eliminate malaria in Zambia. But $30 million, and that's the entirety of their malaria elimination operations. Their foundation has like $1 billion that they spend every year, or not every year, maybe $1 billion over 5 years, but only $30 million allocated to this malaria elimination operation. And what they're trying to do is just show proof of concept to bring other donors like the Global Fund, like the President's Malaria Initiative on board, like USAID and Global Fund. And so they're doing the science and then trying to prime the pump and get the flow going once they can show that, hey, it is possible to eliminate malaria. The top right is Mark Zuckerberg and his wife. I don't know her first name, but they established the Chan and Zuckerberg Initiative. And they gave, I think 99% of their wealth is into this initiative, and they are going to eradicate all disease. It's the goal of the initiative. And it's just started, so we'll see what they do. High-tech stuff, I think, with crazy genetics. Who knows? Ambitious. The bottom right, you have the Clinton family, Hillary, Chelsea, and Bill. And they established the Clinton Global Initiative. In the health world, it's the Clinton Health Access Initiative. And they operate differently from the Gates Foundation and others. They create knowledge and provide technocrats to help countries do stuff. And so a Clinton Health Access Initiative or CHI office might have like 8 people, whereas a USAID office would have like thousands, hundreds or thousands. And so different ways, but they have become a player in helping to set the tone, in challenging more donations, in challenging governments to step up and help, and in trying to make the world a better place. These private foundations. And it's not new. Foundations are not new. So in the late 1800s, you had the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations in the U.S. Before that, you had aristocratic, charitable individuals. But the trends in globalization, all right, the two things: one, the decrease in space and time for communication and trade, and two, the development of novel technologies to improve health, allow these foundations to really gain momentum and really push things forward. So PEPFAR is an important thing in global health financing, and this is a crazy story, PEPFAR. So HIV, was isolated in the 1980s, early 1980s, and quickly the drug companies started trying to treat it, and they found that a leukemia drug, AZT, treated it well and delayed the onset of AIDS. And so in HIV, you get the virus, it starts attacking your immune system, and at some point you develop AIDS, which is simply a state of having a low white blood cell count. So your white blood cells are below a certain threshold, and then without the white blood cells, opportunistic infections jump in, and that's what kills you. So HIV used to be a death sentence, but with AZT, it became you could live with HIV and not develop AIDS, and it would be okay. Now, I wish I should have put this cartoon up. If I knew how, I would put it up. But it's the South Park cartoon. Maybe I can do a Google search for it. Oops. and I think I'm gonna mess things up if I try to play this with sound. But this is worth watching on your own time. Yeah, I'm being blocked. What's going on? Why is it sending me to Hulu instead of YouTube? Yeah. Anyways, the cartoon shows Magic Johnson. If you're familiar with Magic Johnson, he's an American basketball player, great player. Came down with HIV, and everybody thought he'd be dead in 5 years, but he's still alive today because and this was in the 80s when HIV was a death sentence. And South Park makes fun of it because they talk about the cure for AIDS being injection of cash directly into your veins. And Magic Johnson was able to survive because he took money and directly injected that into his veins. And that was a parody of the cost of HIV treatment, where it was thousands of dollars per month for these drugs. And meanwhile, in South Africa, you had the ravaging of HIV across the population, and South Africa took the drugs, re-engineered them, broke the patent, and generated these generic drugs and started distributing those at less than $10 per month for the treatment. And the drug companies cried foul. They came and they said, "Look, you're breaking our patent, and we're going to sue you. You're going to have to pay. This is awful. You're breaking the law." And the Clinton administration sided with the drug companies, and they were pushing South Africa to stop the distribution of generic HIV drugs. Gore's presidential campaign in 2000 against Bush, he was excoriated for this. When he announced that he would run, protesters ran through and talked about him being a killer in South Africa. And Ralph Nader, jumped in on this and said, "Look, you're awful." And the Clinton administration changed its stance and stopped siding with the drug companies. And South Africa won the lawsuit in the World Trade Organization. And it's a seminal piece of global health policy where patent law, private interests do not trump health. So health is first, and if you cannot withhold these life-saving treatments for profit. PEPFAR was established in 2003 by the George W. Bush administration. Well, these cartoons this picture above shows the protests about HIV/AIDS and the drug companies profiteering on that, and then the cartoon below shows an attorney asking, "Can we discuss intellectual property rights?" And then the AIDS people are halfway in the grave. So PEPFAR was established in 2003 by the Bush Foundation, by the George W. Bush administration, and it was $70 billion, and it's contributed $70 billion to HIV treatments and prevention services worldwide. Here's a map of PEPFAR activities. Much of their activities are centrally located or prioritizing Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, a bit of the Caribbean. And you can see the number, this graph on the bottom shows the number of people on antiretroviral therapy from 2004 of 66,000 up to 2005 of 9.5 million. So the PEPFAR is supporting almost 10 million people with their therapies to combat HIV and make sure that it does not develop into AIDS and kill them. Next thing in the U.S. is the President's Malaria Initiative, or PMI, again established by the W. Bush administration in 2005, and it focuses on commodity. A lot of the money goes to commodities, so millions of bed nets, millions of diagnostic tests, millions of therapies for malaria. And this graph on the bottom shows how big a player PMI is in the malaria field, where the light brown is PMI funds, the dark green is Global Fund, and then the others that are contributing to malaria control and prevention. And it's like 2/3 of the Global Fund budget. So a huge amount of money being given through PMI. And it's very fascinating to me. If you go throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, the George W. Bush is adored in that country, in that continent. Across the continent, he is revered. And it was fascinating to me as a master's student at Tulane in 2007, so 10 years ago. And all the American public health students are typically more liberal and they didn't like Bush very much. But at Tulane, we had a lot of African students, and watching the interactions, and I'm pretty moderate, I probably lean more conservative politically, and watching the interactions between the Africans and the Americans about Bush, where the Americans and Americans are a bit bolder in their speech as well, would just talk about him being an awful person, and the Africans would just look at them in complete amazement, thinking, "What? Why? Why do you? Why? How could you hate somebody that gave Africa so much?" Um, Very interesting. But the Bush administration, as you can see in, where is this graph? Oops. Let's see if I can find the right slide here. So the Bush administration really, during the Bush administration, and there are other contributing factors. So you had the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation ramped up, you had the Global Fund ramping up. But from 2000 to 2010, the amount of money going for global health doubled, tripled even. And then with the 2008 recession, 2010, it's kind of leveled off, and there's fears that it will slide back. But but you can see here the sources of that global health financing from the United States dominating, and then the foundations in Europe as well. In 2015, you can see where the money came from, and it's coming from the rich to the poor countries typically. When we look at per capita, Scandinavia especially stands out in donating per population. And then where is it going? Primarily to Sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit to Southeast Asia, South America. And how is it going through? You can see here Gavi is this orange, is the vaccinations. Global Fund is just a small piece. USAID bilaterals are pretty high. In the United States, the foundations and NGOs are huge. And so the increase in state-sponsored aid has been matched by private donations, which is pretty cool. It's really awesome to me, is that the private donations to the NGOs and other foundations, Bill and Melinda Gates foundations, that the individuals are increasing their aid for global health. So that's today's lecture. Want to focus on those two principles, that principles of efficacy, of people being able to feel like they can help because so globalization affects that, where you get information more quickly. The other is the commodities. We didn't talk too much about commodities, but you look at PEPFAR. So one of the reasons for the establishment of PEPFAR is that you have a drug that you can give, and you can go buy a ton of drugs, millions of drugs, and get those to people. And so you have something that will solve the problem. The President's Malaria Initiative, you have the establishment, or you have the rise of these mosquito nets that are super effective. You have a commodity that you can have people buy, and people can do this, and they think it will help. Or the medicines, you have effective medicines and diagnostic tests. And so the scientific innovations and the globalization of communication are two of the major factors that have influenced, in my view, the rise of global health financing. So that's it for today. I will be back on Thursday, and we'll have a discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals. Hope this works well for you to learn a little bit about global health financing, and I will see you Thursday.